the end of March, the Prony Resources Consortium acquired the struggling Goro operation in New Caledonia from Vale. Goro, when operational, will provide an insignificant amount of nickel to the market, and yet the deal is of huge consequence to the nickel market. What is significant about this acquisition is the timing, coming just days after the nickel price endured its largest two-day drop in over a decade. The rout was single-handedly caused by a mere social media post on WeChat by nickel's new giant, Tsingshan. Tsingshan's plans to convert NPI to nickel matte, suitable for refining to battery-grade nickel, dispelled any fears the market may have had of massive nickel deficits. So, at a time when the market sees a steady flow of low-cost nickel coming out of Indonesia for the foreseeable future, why would Prony Resources acquire a troublesome high-cost operation that will never be competitive with Tsingshan? And why would Tesla get involved as an advisor on the deal? The answer to these questions is that the Prony Resources acquisition is a bet that ESG issues would equalize the market by limiting the market for poor ESG performing operations and creating niche opportunities for those who boast superior ESG credentials. Tsingshan, who was completely unknown on the world stage just 15 years ago, is now the world's biggest producer of nickel and stainless steel. Their rapid growth was initially based on importing Indonesian ore into their Chinese plants, where they innovated to use RKEFs to produce NPI, which was then hot charged directly into their stainless plants. This created a low-cost model based on the cheap supply of ore from Indonesia. When Indonesia banned ore exports in 2014, Tsingshan was the only company ready to react. They had already established the footprint of the Indonesia Morowali Industrial Park by the time the ban came into force. They then moved to secure ore supplies in Indonesia, where miners had no choice but to sell their ore to the only buyer in the country. Tsingshan ramped up production at record speeds and added production lines constantly. With several years' head start on other investors, they have maintained a dominant position in the market and have grown to around 370,000 tons of nickel last year. That's 72% more than the next biggest global producer, Vale, who has nickel operations spread all over the world. With 7 years of massive growth, the market now understands that Tsingshan can build and ramp up RKF plants at the snap of its fingers. They build quickly and cheaply and constantly. But so far, these RKF plants have only been used to produce NPI for stainless steel. With NPI production booming, there was a distinct lack of investment in projects to produce battery-grade nickel for the electric vehicle market. With EV forecasts soaring, Elon Musk literally pleaded with miners to produce more battery-grade nickel. This led to the nickel price climbing to highs that hadn't been seen in years. Some HPAL projects were in development in Indonesia, but these had faced some delays and uncertainties. Yet, in March, all the hype seemingly ended with one simple post on Chinese social media site WeChat. Tsingshan announced that it would make nickel matte through its RKEFs and supply this to the battery market. At once, the market realized that if Tsingshan can do this, there would be no shortfall in battery-grade nickel supply. Everyone knows how quickly Tsingshan can build RKEFs. With the nickel price in free fall, why then would Prony Resources want to acquire a struggling, high-cost operation that may never make money at today's nickel price? Evidently, they believe that Tsingshan's planned matte production in Indonesia will not be accepted by Western EV makers. Selling stainless steel from Indonesia is one thing, but the EV market is a completely different proposition. EV consumers are, by nature, environmentally and socially conscious consumers. One does not make the shift to an EV without some sort of motivation to make a difference in the transition to renewable energy. These consumers are also well informed. While the vehicle may run with zero emissions, EV consumers are aware of the environmental and social impacts further up the supply chain. The connection between consumer and mining impact came to the fore in 2016 when Amnesty International released a report into child labour in the cobalt supply chain. This report highlighted that a significant portion of world cobalt supply to popular consumer items like smartphones and laptops was linked to DRC cobalt mines where child labour was frequently found. The report and the accompanying social media campaign shocked consumers by making them realize they were possibly carrying a phone that had parts mined by a child in Africa. It led to calls for an embargo on DRC cobalt and has caused a major shift in thinking for the entire battery metal supply chain. Now, EV makers and their battery suppliers continue to move towards low cobalt or even zero cobalt batteries. The situation is remarkably similar in nickel today. Where the DRC dominated cobalt supply, now Indonesia dominates nickel. And, as with DRC cobalt, there are significant ESG concerns with Indonesian nickel. Before Tsingshan announced its plans to convert NPI to matte, the key battery-grade nickel projects in the pipeline were Indonesian HPAL projects. Initially, these projects were planning to copy the Ramu nickel model from Papua New Guinea, where the HPAL residue is disposed into the deep sea below the main active marine environment. This method of residue disposal has always been controversial. While there are technical merits to the idea in certain situations, EV makers would have been extremely nervous about having to accept nickel linked to this type of waste disposal. These concerns quickly drifted up the supply chain, with Indonesian HPAL projects shifting to look for an alternative method of residue disposal. The conventional alternative is a tailings dam. While tailings dams carry significant risk, at least the risks are more easily defined and so are somewhat less controversial. Still, when things go wrong with tailings dams, the impacts are extreme. Two recent massive tailings dam failures in Brazil have brought this into perspective, vividly showing the world just how catastrophic a dam failure can be. In Indonesia, these risks are even higher, given Indonesia's high level of seismic activity and the high rainfall. The frequent tropical deluges make dam design and management challenging. The other alternative is dewatering the tailings, then disposing in a dry stack. This is a less common method of disposal, as the dewatering process carries some technical risk and additional cost. However, this seems to be the preferred method for the Indonesian HPAL projects at this time. Although there still remains some engineering work to be done, and government permits have not yet been issued. It was these risks, along with HPAL's well-documented technical risk, that had EV makers worried that the nickel produced from Indonesian HPALs would not be sufficient to meet the growing demand. By deciding to use RKEF technology to convert NPI to matte, Tsingshan was able to bypass the HPAL risks and use the reliable RKEFs to meet future demand. Yet immediately, other nickel producers were quick to point out the ESG risks of this plan. The main criticism is that RKEFs require massive amounts of energy, and this is currently supplied by coal-fired power plants. Tsingshan's main industrial park in Indonesia has 2,500 megawatts of coal-fired power, and this is just one of the industrial parks that supplies Indonesian nickel to the world. More parks are under development, and all of these currently use coal-fired power. The idea of a clean and green EV industry built upon nickel produced from coal-fired power goes against the entire EV sales proposition. But while the HBAL residue issue and the RKEF carbon footprint issue are both well known and are attracting much attention, there is a lesser known issue of biodiversity looming under the radar. Indonesia is a tropical archipelago with vast areas of tropical rainforest. It was during his expedition in Indonesia that naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace developed his thoughts on natural selection, which was then taken on by Darwin in his theory of evolution. So unique is the biodiversity of this region that it has been named Wallacea in honor of Wallace. It so happens that the nickel laterite resources of Indonesia are located right in the center of this Wallacea region. The nature of laterite deposits invariably means that the ore is located in hilly land that is unsuited to agriculture. As such, the laterite deposits are almost always still covered by tropical rainforest, which must be cleared to make way for the mines. With good mining practices, it is possible to conserve the topsoil and rehabilitate the rainforest after the ore is extracted. Unfortunately, not all miners do this, and many areas are left as barren landscapes after the high-grade ore is removed. Apart from the loss of habitat, the exposed soil in the wet tropics leads to significant erosion, affecting rivers and also coastal environments. Chinese visitors to the nickel mining area of Morowali often refer to the area as the Red Sea, as this seems to be the lingering memory from their trips. These images were taken in the same location, one before a mine was established further upstream, while the image on the right was taken a few years later and shows how the nickel mine transformed the aquatic environment. Because of these issues, Prony Resources clearly believes that EV makers will want alternatives to Indonesian nickel. While having alternatives is always a good thing, the additional 40,000 tons or so that Goro will produce is clearly insufficient to meet the needs of the EV industry. Unless we see a lot of other new nickel projects very soon, it is unlikely that EV makers can afford to exclude Indonesian nickel from their supply chains. Indeed, it is not entirely clear if the ESG risks actually warrant such a move. While there was a clear need to address human rights issues in the DRC supply chain, the issues in nickel are not so clear-cut. The child labour in the cobalt mines crosses a clear line in the sand and needs to be stopped. The environmental issues in the nickel supply chain are far more nuanced. All nickel mines have a carbon footprint. All nickel mines produce waste. All nickel mines impact biodiversity. Many Western nickel producers are keen to draw a line in the sand right in between their operations and those in Indonesia, but who is to say that this line is in the right place? In response to the cobalt human rights issues, supply chain due diligence has become a key part of managing ESG risk in the supply chain. The methods, which are based on the OECD due diligence guidelines for minerals in conflict-affected areas, has been well accepted and are being well implemented across the industry. There are now efforts to replicate these in other energy transition metal supply chains, including nickel. However, the current scope of the guidelines and standards does not sufficiently cover the environmental issues encountered in nickel. More specifically, there is nothing in the standards and nothing in the supplier guidelines from EV makers that would prevent a battery supplier from using nickel linked to submarine tailings, coal-fired power generation, or massive biodiversity impacts. In the absence of clear guidance from EV makers, the battery suppliers will be hard-pressed to avoid Indonesian nickel. Indonesian producers are also well aware of market sentiment and are taking steps to improve ESG performance. If the flow of nickel from Indonesia continues, the Prony Resources bet on Goro may be one they come to regret.